Thanks, Lauren. So we have a fantastic panel today ready to talk about the emerging technology, specifically focusing on the availability of AI. So I'll actually let the panelists introduce themselves. So Hakim, if you want to start.
Yeah. Hello. Is it working? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I'm Hakim. Not Hakim Graham, but Hakim Elakhrass. I'm one of the co-founders of NannyML, and we build software to monitor the performance of machine learning models in production. So quite interestingly tied to the whole ethics debate before, but more on the technologist side of things. So really focus on building the technology that allow us to estimate the performance, the real world performance of AI, making sure it's performing well, and that it's always adding value. And my personal background, I am a technologist. I've been a data scientist for many years. And alongside NannyML, I also own a machine learning consultancy that's been putting machine learning models in production for quite some time now for companies like UCB and Nike and things like that.
Great. Hi, this has been incredible so far. So much a wealth of information, so I have to give it up for Altada for having such a great symposium. I had to say that first. My name is Kevin Sharpley, so I'm the COO and co-founder of Xavatar. So we're doing autonomous animated avatars for video telecommunications, so Zoom, Google Chat, Facebook Messenger, and then we're building a metaverse for those avatars to inhabit. So it's been really exciting to see how the market is, over the past 6 months, really become electric, because it was quite difficult to talk about it before Facebook made the turn towards Meta. So it's very exciting. A little bit of background on myself. I run a company, Kajik Multimedia, which is a branding and an entertainment company. So we've always pushed the limits of tech, and that's everything from your traditional film, media, and entertainment things, but also virtual reality and augmented reality that creates this whole kind of immersive media space that, like I said, has become really electric and exciting. So.
Hello, everybody. My name's Mark Woolnough. I'd like to start off by saying I'm quite jealous of Kevin and his role. I think that's something that I'd quite like to do. But I actually come from a background in operations, analytics, and data and AI, essentially. So up till recently, I was working as a systems architect for IBM. Focused primarily on data and AI, and looking at their IBM Z, or Z as I should say over here, platforms, power, and their storage infrastructure offerings as well. And leading up to that, I was also working with IBM's partnership with NVIDIA, particularly around deep learning applications, and systems offerings focused around the technology that was sort of used to build two of the largest supercomputers in the world at the time, which was the Coral Summit and Coral Sierra in Oak Ridge National Laboratories. So that was the kind of technology that I cut my teeth with in the world of AI, particularly on the platform side, and that's how I met Mr. Alan Beechner a few years ago. So, and that's how I've ended up here somehow. So it's very nice to be here.
Hi, I'm Sarah O'Connell, head of software engineering for Altada. Probably don't need to introduce that company. So a little bit about my background. I've spent the past 20 years, maybe a little more, working in software. So either building software products or more recently managing teams that are building the software. So I've come from, similar to Mark, a background in IBM. I think we actually came through the same acquisition,
Yeah.
which, it's a small world.
Naming all the people that we know. Yeah.
So we knew a lot of people. So yeah, through Valent, IBM, and then I joined Tyco. So I guess background in cloud, IBM Bluemix, although it's IBM Cloud now, right? Yeah. And then into Tyco, where it was smart buildings, smart cities, Johnson Controls, where it was more security operations center software. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Right, so thanks, Sarah. I'd like to stay with you. So we've heard Brian mention in the previous talk about the teams and being one of the most valuable assets within Altada. So within software engineering, trying to kind of complement and support the AI development, What sort of teams do you need to take an AI from an algorithm to a commercial product?
Yeah, so I think Brian actually stole my answer, really. So in Altada, we have what we call the technology team, and that's broken up into the data science team, who really form, I guess, the core of Altada. And they're obviously building out the AI and ML platform, an engine that we use. And then in more recent months, we have additional teams that are coming on board to actually augment the work that the data science team are doing. So that would be software engineering, which is the team that I lead. We also have cloud platforms, which deal with the underlying infrastructure and cloud deployment. We have emerging tech that Graham is leading. And we also have the technical delivery team as well that helps bring it all together and make sure that we can actually deploy this. And I guess if we're thinking about software and the role that my team plays in helping the data science team, create and deploy that platform, what we're doing is we're kind of taking the output that the data science team are actually creating, and we're the interface between that output and the user. So generally that comes in the form of a front-end application. So we're building React applications, we're taking the output from the data science team, and we're visualizing that to the user. And what's quite important to us is that we simplify that output. So data science, artificial intelligence, all of the things that Altada is doing behind the scenes, it can be quite complex, and you can tell from all the conversations we've had today, they're quite in-depth. There's a lot of complication behind all of that, and what we're trying to do in the software team, and in particular with our front ends, is actually take away that complication and make it, introduce simplicity. And part of that is something we've been working on for the past few months, is introducing Altada's design system. And what our design system does is it provides a common language for the look and feel for all of our products. So going forward, our goal is that every product that Altada produces has a consistent look and feel. So when a customer comes along, they're looking at our website, they're seeing the branding here. And Brian was mentioning about protecting that branding. We want to bring that right down to the products and make sure that when the customer that opens up the application, they're seeing the correct branding, the correct colors, and the logo is there. And not only that, this kind of simplifies the entire process for the Altada customer. And I guess what plays into that as well is the user experience, and that's something we're really building up, and we're trying to build our expertise in that as well. And I guess that's kind of the front-end aspect, and maybe the first step that a customer takes into their journey into Altada is seeing the output in the front end. But we're also translating that into the back end. So we're starting up an API strategy where we want a consistent feel as well in our API strategy, because that's another conduit into the output that the data science platform is actually creating. So the insights that the data science platform is generating, can come through the front end. It can also come through that API. So a consistent feel to the software that we're producing is quite important to us, and it's probably one of the major functions of my role and my team particularly.
Thanks, Sarah. So Mark, obviously Sarah's outlined the different teams and the collaboration. So between each of these different teams, obviously you have your integration points, you have the data being passed back and forth. What considerations do we need to think about when we're passing data back and forth? And we heard the ethics panel earlier on mention privacy by design, ethics by design. Yeah. So how do we make sure that the technology teams adopt those practices and not kind of hinder the progress or hinder the acceleration of the development?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think that I kind of start with, AI is built with data, right? And it's nothing without data. So you need to figure out ways to understand where that data lives and what you're going to do with it. So, many enterprises have quite complex environments now. They have hybrid multi-cloud environments where they have on-premise systems of record, they have data services in the cloud, different cloud vendors as well. So really what you have to do, I think, is look at data gravity there, look at where the data that you're using for training AI. So I mean, we didn't really talk much about AI lifecycle actually, but everything that was mentioned before was all around building, training AI, and deploying AI, and that's what you're in the business of, right? So I think that what you need to do is look at your data strategy, and I guess when you're deploying AI applications, you're using sort of maybe containerized sort of instances and things like that. So packages that you can easily deploy and embedding AI into that as well. And I think that what you have to look at as well is when you're moving data around, you need to do it securely. You need to make sure that you can move that data with a clear conscience and knowing that it's going to be hard to infiltrate it. So it was mentioned earlier on, just using encryption as a way to do that is just a really basic example of securing your data. You can encrypt it in transit, and you can encrypt it at rest as well. And if you encrypt it at rest, then many platform providers will give you that kind of capability, almost like as a binary switch to be able to do that. And I think another really important thing, something that's emerging at the moment, is sort of cyber resiliency and cyber attacks, and bad actors that are infiltrating and installing ransomware. And one thing that I learned in my role as a systems architect last year was that ransomware is actually installed and it's not actioned for months. So it's there, it's sitting there in its own sinister way, and then somebody will enable that maybe 5 to 6 months later. So what I started to do in the role of the systems architect was to start looking at helping clients with their data strategy in terms of backup. And they really need to sort of review that and see, the world is changing, and the world of storage is changing as well, right? So you've got flash storage, which is super quick. And what you can do is you could do something like create an immutable copy of maybe your access management sort of side of the house. So if you can create an immutable copy on primary storage of your access management, maybe it's Microsoft Active Directory or something like that, then you have a way to restore that super quick. And if it's immutable, it's read-only, and it means that only one super user can access that data as well. So there is things that you can do around security. And then, we had that really fantastic session earlier on around ethics in AI and explainability. I've briefed AI to many of the banks in London. They used to be my clients, and they won't entertain the thought of creating a decision engine around that will approve loans or mortgages or anything like that using AI unless you can have a fully explainable way to and it was touched upon before as well. And then there's GDPR. So if I was to look at building an application, I would definitely make sure that there was no sensitive personal information in there. I'd remove that before I actually started training my AI models. So there's many considerations there to sort of get stuck into, I think. But one of the beauties of, I guess, Altada is that this will all be baked in best practice to when they actually create the stuff. So rather than you having to do it all in isolation and manage all this, this is all what you do by osmosis, right? You put all the explainability and GDPR sort of considerations, I would have thought, because there's tools out there that help you do that, right? So there's technology tools and machine learning explainability like Lime. These are all standard things that you can embed into creating and training your AI and making sure that you do it in the right way.
Thanks, Mark. So again, we've looked at the development process, we've looked at the data. So what actually happens after you deploy a solution? There's a couple of challenges from an AI point of view to make sure that the performance is always kept up to speed, that the data is the most up-to-date data. How are NannyML kind of looking at these challenges and creating solutions to help companies kind of deliver AI solutions that stay on top of their game?
Yeah, I think the main thing is a lot of people think that the AI lifecycle stops at deployment, and that either machine learning models or AI in general is some sort of self-learning system in the real world, when in reality, most of the time, you train an AI on historical data, you then put it into the real world to make decisions, and technically, the only performance that you know is the performance that you calculated on your historical data when you were building your AI. So the issue that arises then is, what is my performance right now? And I can give a very good example. So it affects a lot of different machine learning use cases. It's definitely use case dependent, but something like credit scoring, where you predict whether or not someone should get a loan. You know how these models perform essentially on historical data. And then you put it out into the real world, and it decides yes or no, someone should get a loan. And the only time you know if that decision was correct, in reality, is when either the person defaults on the loan or they pay back the loan. So you actually don't really know your real model performance. And so when we started NannyML and we were like, okay, how do we solve this problem? We couldn't find anything from, I'm a technologist, so from a technologist perspective, there were not really that many algorithms. I mean, there were nothing, actually. There was nothing that allowed you to know your real world AI performance. And so that's where we started, and we started doing research, and then we were finally able to come up with an algorithm that can actually robustly estimate the performance of machine learning models in production without having access to ground truth, and to do so rather robustly. And of course, these are only like the technological problems. There's a lot of problems with change management and how people use AI. I can tell a very funny story where we also have a machine learning consultancy where we had a project where our client actually asked us to put business rules on top of the output of our machine learning model to make it look more human. So it was not about the performance. It was like, yeah, it's weird that it's predicting all zeros for these days. It doesn't look like how a human would make a decision, so change it. And not based on anything other than that. So there's definitely the human aspect of it, but from an AI perspective, not knowing the performance of your models is a big thing. And of course, in some use cases, you do know the performance, but in many, many you don't. Like in credit scoring, in customer churn prediction, you only know the use case, the actual reality 30 to 90 days in the future. In automation systems like document classification, although they tend to be a bit more stable, you actually never know the real ground truth, else it wouldn't be, then there would be no purpose in automating it because we define ground truth as labeled by a human at least. And that's one part of it, is just the pure performance of the AI. But there's actually another aspect that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that what is AI performance? How do you define how your AI is performing? So as data scientists, we look at technical metrics, F1, ROC AUC, R squared, all of these technical metrics to determine whether your AI is performing well. But the thing is, we're supposed to try and pick a proxy for business impact, for how well it's performing in a business context. So to take an example of credit scoring, you might say that we want to have a credit scoring model that gives a default rate of 10%. So 10% of people who get approved for a loan might default. And through some experimentation, you might find that you need, a ROC AUC of 0.6%, sorry, 0.6, not percent, 0.6 to achieve that business metric. But actually, over time, the relationship between the technical metric and the business metric might change because these systems are dynamic. You're taking a decision on a customer, and then you act on that decision. You either give them a loan, or in churn, you decide to set a retention campaign to stop them from churning. And then at a later point in time, the same AI system is making a decision on that same data point or that same customer. And so that means that actually the models impact the data and the data impacts the models. And so that means the relationship between the technical metrics and the business metric might change. And in 6 months, you might need a ROC AUC of 0.7 or 0.8 to achieve the same default rate of 10%. So it's a combination of technical metrics changing and the relationship between technical metrics and business metrics changing. And I think, it's very early days in the world of machine learning. And as more and more models go into production, we're going to see a lot more issues related to these things. And the example that we always give at NannyML is Zillow. They're the gift that keeps on giving. They're literally on the front page of our pitch deck. So they systematically overpriced 7,000 houses by $300 million. And they had to sell all the houses, and they lost $300 million. But that's not all. When the news broke, their market cap dropped by $32 billion. So essentially, by not monitoring the performance of their machine learning, or not knowing it, they lost a lot of money. And I think we're going to keep hearing stories like this until people start to actually take it seriously. But a big part of it is the technology doesn't even exist to do so, and there's still a lot of research and development to be done.
Thanks, Hakim. So Kevin, I'd like to move on to you. Your area, which is very kind of immersive, interactive, kind of visual side and experiential side of media. And I think we're all wondering what a day in the life of Kevin would look like. But in your industry, what sort of a role does machine learning and artificial intelligence play, and what does the integration points of the two of them within your industry look like?
Yeah, so, I think that some of those points were already mentioned. So I think we opened up with Spotify, for example. And at the end of the year, you get this kind of dynamic, look at what you've done over Spotify, the music that you listen to. And so that's all collecting data to spew that out. It's super exciting. It's really a data-driven industry now. So I talked about Netflix, and I said I wasn't going to talk about Netflix anymore because, they lost 200,000 users. But you're right. But it is a data-driven company. And I think that that's what allowed Netflix to capture the market share that they were able to capture, because they knew their users, they knew the type of content that they wanted to look at. In addition, they're able to target specifically, what this person wants to watch, what time they want to watch it, and find new users utilizing that data. And of course, they use AI for that. So that's just one layer, one level. But I can talk about Xavatar. And this is really exciting because we're in a salsa accelerator. And so that's been such an incredible experience because it's allowed us to really look at AI in a holistic way and how it can be utilized in what we're doing. So when I mentioned Xavatar, we're doing autonomous animated avatars for video telecommunication. Just from the onset, you upload your picture or you take your video, we have to have a data set of different gestures and different movements and eyebrows and colors and that need to be drawn from in order to adhere to what the user looks like. So that's just one layer. But because we're doing autonomous animation, eventually what people will be able to do is use their avatar just by their voice. So right now we're facial recognition, vocal recognition, but you'll be able to use your avatar just by, speaking. So people will be able to, if you have on headphones, walk away. If you're doing your video telecommunication, you'll be able to go to the other side of the room, and your avatar will be able to have your gestures. It will learn your gestures over time. So that is an integrative way, but what that does is it creates autonomous animation. And with autonomous animation, then animation companies, animators will be able to use these avatars within their animation, cut the price of whatever they're doing, because all you need is your voice, and we're doing that as well. All you need is your voice in order to animate these characters, that the characters have already learned your gestures. They've already learned your movements. So just on that layer alone. But then when you talk about the metaverse and what we're doing with that, which I'm not going to go too far into it, but we can now have our metaverse be transformative over time by the way people interact with that metaverse. And so for certain, you need this kind of, robust database. I'm not going to go into, the things that Facebook does in terms of targeting people and, the facial recognition and things like that. But it does allow you to really understand your users and your community. And this is really the mark of what's now going to be the film and entertainment industry moving forward. I mean, the metaverse market alone by 2024 will be an over $800 billion market. There's a reason for that. By 2030, it'll be over $3 trillion. There's a reason for that. We talk about metaverse, and I hate to just say metaverse. We call our metaverse the Zataverse. And, it's immersive media. So it's not just, you put on your virtual reality glasses and you go in there. You can use augmented. People will be able to use just their phones. Even if you have an older computer, you'll be able to use the arrow keys, And so, you really need that data to be able to outreach to people and to connect with people on many different layers and levels. It's so exciting. So.
Thanks. So in Alan's presentation at the beginning, you mentioned human and machine collaboration. So as we're moving towards this animation, the metaverse, how do we maintain the human element as we start to look at these emerging technologies?
Yeah, so that's why this particular summit has been super interesting, because you have to have that ESG, You have to have a governance that goes along with it. And then that's the integration of the people within there, you know, having those monitors and having those layers that allow that human interaction, that human connection to be prevalent. It has to be prevalent, it has to be upfront and dynamic. In addition, you know, because what we're doing is, you know, these autonomous avatars, that human element is vitally important because they're autonomous and because you'll be able to walk away and because your avatar will be able to move without you being necessarily present, there needs to be in place these kind of controls so that, you know, your avatar doesn't go and interact with someone in an improper way, for example. You know, there's a lot of talk about policing now, the metaverse, and, you know, predatory behavior and, you know, a lot of these things. So where the human element comes in is being able to parse out the ability to push those things away, and the ability for, you know, people to have their own personal space, for people to have their own ability to do what they want to do. And I'm saying metaverse, but also, you know, the augmented world is going to be transformative as well. But having the ability without having to think about, you know, predatory behavior or having to think about someone coming and invading your space. You know, that is as important as the technology part of it. So.
Thank you. So you mentioned the Alcesar program. So for those of you who don't know, Altada run an AI accelerator called Alcesar, where every year we reward the winners $250,000 to further their development, and we also provide mentorship and support as well. There's a stand outside, and Sylvia is around as well if you have any further details. I definitely recommend checking it out. But Mark, as we look at kind of, you know, the next kind of, you know, data in terms of the systems and how they all interact with each other, what additional challenges do you see companies being able to innovate? So obviously Kevin mentioned the accelerator. In terms of creating innovation practices that accelerate AI, how do we create companies that enable employees to kind of really understand and be able to submit their ideas in a way in which you know that they're going to be delivered and create the next wave of technology?
Yeah, I think the answer to that, the underlying theme is kind of addressing skills gap and automation as well, right? So I think that if you look at you know, challenges that companies have at the moment or organizations when they're building AI, it's really the complexity of it, right? So we can all go off and build and train an AI model and be quite happy with it, get it nice and accurate, but there's still a huge chasm to get to when it comes to deploying it, and as was said before, sort of monitoring it and making sure that you know, it remains relevant and it does its function, and the whole kind of life cycle of AI is really critical. So it's a hard thing to do, right? So I think that what you need is a fail fast mentality, and you need to be able to use tooling that will accelerate that cycle, if you like. So I'm not really a data scientist myself. I know enough to be dangerous, and I can, you know, get hold of a Python Jupyter notebook and, you know, follow this, that, and the other and create my machine learning model, give myself a nice pat on the back. But I think that really what we need to do is look at how we can make organizations more productive with data science. So there's a lot of really good tooling out there around automated AI, and I think that, you know, I have problems sort of explaining auto AI because people think, oh, it's a black box. I'm not going to touch that because it's a black box. So, you know, the simple answer to that is that you build explainability into your black box, and then you have explainable AI. So it's actually really good. And then from there, it's a case of just baking in best practice with what your data scientists would do, what their domain expertise is. But then you need to, so I think auto AI is a really good thing. It's a great productivity tool, and it allows you to fail fast, right? So you don't go down a cul-de-sac, waste time and energy and money on something that will never work. You'll find out really, really quickly with AI, auto AI, whether it will work or not. Then there's sort of the concept of, and it was interesting listening to Alan earlier on when he said that, you know, primarily focusing on financial services at the moment, right? I know that there are other industries that Altada will tackle and pivot into, but the point being here is that you need data science expertise and you need industry expertise as well. You need to tie those two together because, and it sounds simple to do, but what happens is you actually start to infiltrate process and institutional kind of silos and things like that. So in a large company, you might have a team of data scientists here, you actually have the application owners over here, and you need to bring them together. So I think that's a big challenge, right? So yeah, any kind of AI projects that I would be involved in, I'd make sure that you had the right kind of cast of characters that you needed there, the right industry domain expertise, because they will know the value of the data. As a data scientist, you can kind of see the value, and you can provide them with that input, and they can, but they need to verify it to say, yes, you're onto something here. This is actually valuable to the business. So I think that, you know, what Altada are doing, they're on this journey, right, clearly, where they have the data science chops, they have the know-how to create machine learning models, to deploy them, to manage them, and then build applications around them, which is a phenomenal kind of ensemble of skills that you need to do that. And yeah, it's just combining that all into getting sort of the applications that you need out at the end of it. So yeah, you know, and in doing that, they're becoming experts in financial services, right? So it's a kind of beautiful thing. It's like a symbiotic relationship where you start to build that expertise, and then all of a sudden, use cases will start to explode out of that as you discover your own domain expertise in financial services as well as data science. So it's really, really potent stuff, I think.
Thanks, Mark. So you mentioned people and talent, and Hakim, I know that's one of your key areas that you're interested in. I read a recent quote from you saying, a very important question you should ask yourself is, what type of organization do you want to build? So how important is a culture, is the right people in building an organization?
I think it's the most important thing you do. I think if there's one thing you should be doing, whether you're building a department or being a founder, is being able to find the right people and to enable them with a good culture so that they can thrive and do their best work. I think as a founder, I would say that 60% of my time or so goes into recruitment. So quite a lot of effort to try and hire the best people. And I really do think it's the most important thing you can do. And it's been very interesting with COVID and like the whole hiring people remotely, because I think that's also like a big enabler to being able to find the right people wherever they might be, not only in just one geographic location. But then, of course, the whole remote thing does introduce some cultural challenges, and you really have to look at it from a first principles perspective on how, even remotely, can we have a good company culture that enables people to do the best work. So I would say it's like super important.
Great. And Sarah, following on from that, so how do companies leverage ecosystems to create that next talent pipeline, and also what support services are there to enable companies to maybe benefit from financial services as well, like in terms of support, in terms of collaborations, engagements, like how do companies leverage the ecosystem to support them during the development process?
Yeah, so I suppose there's several ways to achieve that, you know, in terms of collaborations, as you mentioned. I know Aoife from Slice Data is going to be talking later. So, you know, creating partnerships with other up-and-coming startups and companies is really important to bring, you know, innovation back into your company as well. There's also university engagement, and this is, you know, a way of, you know, addressing that skills gap. You know, in Altada, we have a number of interns actually working for us, and the background of those interns is quite varied, actually. We have them at every level, from undergraduate degrees, where you might expect that they're studying computer science, and they come in for 6 to 8 months as part of their degree program. So they typically might be a little bit raw. You know, could be their first actually work engagement with a company, but they still bring a really unique perspective to the company. And then kind of moving up from there, we also have interns at an MSc level, and what they're bringing is, the work that they're doing as part of their dissertation, which can be, incredibly relevant to the work that Altada is doing. It could be completely separate, but it's still bringing a good, fresh perspective to the company. And quite often, actually, and we have, I have two particular in mind that we've working with us right now, and they have 4 to 5 years industrial experience behind them. So they're actually coming into us as, practically a senior engineer, even though they're doing an internship. So that's really a good way of fostering innovation and, right up to PhD level. And then I guess for Altada to bring that back into the university, we have an engagement with University of Limerick, and they are creating an immersive software engineering program with Stripe, actually. And as part of this program, the students, I believe it's a 4-year program, 3-year actually, the students will have a number of residencies with different companies throughout the degree program, and companies can sign up for these residencies, and they get a student into the company for 6 months at a time. And what this is doing, it's allowing the student come into the company and experience what it's like to work for a commercial entity and what real world project software development will be. But it also means that as the student grows throughout the program, the company, as they come back to the company for a different residency, we're getting that learning back into us as well. And as part of that program, Altada has the opportunity to actually influence the curriculum as well. So, pushing back down into the student populace, what we need to be addressed in terms of a skills gap. I think you mentioned funding as well. Yeah. So I'm kind of going to talk about the Irish ecosystem a little bit. I'm not an expert, but I've been involved in some projects that have worked with the EU. The EU has several initiatives. Horizon is quite famous. That's one mechanism for a company to actually engage with other companies, as well as universities, and access really cutting edge research, and have it all funded as part of a particular problem that you might want solved. Yeah, I think.
So with the next wave of kind of talent, and also then the next wave of technology, like Alan mentioned quantum earlier on, what sort of an impact will that have on the development pipeline, and how do you see kind of the next generation of software development teams look like in terms of creating products?
Yeah, so I guess in Altada, we're looking at quantum, we're looking at blockchain, federated learning, all quite complex topics, and it's not realistic to expect people coming out of university, or even senior and principal engineers, to actually have this background in those kind of technologies. And I guess it's not new for software engineers to upskill, but at the same time, you can't be an expert in everything. So I guess one way of addressing that is introducing the concept of micro teams, where you have these small teams that are actually expert in these areas, and they might create software and reusable components that then can be used across the entire organization. So they might develop a library, using quantum and bringing that expertise into that, and then release it out to the company so that other teams and other engineers can actually utilize that learning, but not necessarily have to have that huge deep knowledge into the topic, but still they can access the output of that and build an application and an entire ecosystem using that. I think reusability, developing things like microservices, which we're all familiar with, that kind of framework is coming into the front ends as well. The whole concept of micro front ends is all playing into that.
Thanks. And Hakim, just to kind of follow on from that, so looking at what you have done with NannyML in terms of understanding the performance of models after being deployed, is there opportunities to apply that process to, say, companies to try and become more analytics driven and to try and really look at the performance of how companies are evolving over time? Yeah,
so there's a term I've been using more recently that I call like the hedge fundification of industry. So basically, what I think is going to happen, or what we think is going to happen, is essentially as more and more companies start using machine learning to take critical decisions, they will start to operate more like a hedge fund than like a traditional enterprise. But the main problem there is that originally analytics technology has only been available to hedge funds and to big banks and things like that and insurance companies who have developed like a really strong risk culture, and they really understand risk and risk management. And then you take maybe a scale up like Zillow, or a more traditional enterprise like a media company who don't normally take quantitative decisions, or have not in the past, but because of the advent of all the big data technology, they're pushing a lot of models into production, and they're starting to take decisions that seem like they're not super risky, but in reality can have huge systematic effects. Like, for instance, if you have a client that has a customer churn model, and it's a large enterprise, like a large media company that does a few $1 billion in revenue, and they have a model that predicts whether or not a customer, for instance, will cancel an online subscription. And as that model predicts things on their customer base, management starts to take decisions on the company strategy and things of that nature. And they start to actually base major strategic decisions on the output of machine learning models. And then in the end, there was some systematic risk that they weren't aware of, and everything kind of fails, like for instance in the Zillow case. And I think, like, I don't want to be all doom and gloom, because I do think there's going to be a lot of these huge failures unless companies really kind of start to take that whole risk management seriously. And I don't think it's realistic to expect a media company to really have an entire risk department like a hedge fund. I find it interesting because it's like also like the ethics panel earlier, they were also talking about auditing and all of these things that you would also hear normally in the financial services sector. I'm not sure exactly how they're going to translate to traditional industry, but what I think we're trying to do also with NannyML is to relieve that burden a little bit of the risk. So by understanding your model performance, by understanding how it changes over time, by knowing how your models are performing, you can in general take better decisions. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting as more and more companies take very serious decisions based on the output of quantitative models, especially companies that don't have experience in those kind of things. But I do think as long as companies are starting to become aware of it, and I think they are, unfortunately there's going to be a lot of martyrs along the way, like Zillow. Some will survive, some won't. But I think it will become clear that it's very important to understand how your performance changes, what the risk is by taking decisions based on the output of models, and how that will impact your organization.
Thanks, Hakim. So speaking on companies evolving and adapting over time, so we've seen the evolution of technology and computers go from like large computers down to supercomputers that we're able to put in our pockets. What can you see the trends-wise in terms of AI and manufacturers? Is it the same trend? Are they going to go like on chip, on device, and how will that accelerate then the availability of AI?
Yeah, so I mean, my background, I mean, I've kind of witnessed the birth of a lot of the AI stories, and a lot of the technology that we use now, like, conversation agents and decision engines and things like that. So, I look at, the existing, so I'm having a moment, it's jet lag, I think. Give me a second, okay? I'll just refer to some notes that I made. Hang on a sec. All right, I'll get there in a minute, I promise. It'll be worth the wait.
And as well, like if you could touch on maybe some of the partnerships that you have done with the likes of NVIDIA as well, and how that can
So I was going to talk about the evolution of all this stuff and my involvement in it. And I used to work in IT operations analytics, so that was the first kind of using predictive analytics with monitoring data to be able to start predicting failures in infrastructure, okay, in the IT service management world. And then, I used that as a jumping off point to then do all the fun stuff with, the NVIDIA partnership that we had. So I started looking at visual AI and looking at manufacturing in AI. And I was starting to build models for object detection and image classification, that sort of thing, fun stuff. But then we started to apply that in manufacturing, right? So quality inspection and using that technique, that deep learning technique, to be able to detect imperfections on the manufacturing line. It's really, really powerful, actually. It can do things that traditional computer vision just can't get anywhere close to. Okay, but what I found is that as I was looking at this, camera manufacturers started to release cameras with onboard AI models already baked in. So in the time that it was taking me to sort of get my skill and get going in this, I found that the industry verticals that exist here started to overtake me because they knew that there was a demand for this and they could see the opportunity there. So that's kind of where that sort of industry vertical sort of in IT service management that's now turned into AI ops where there's more sophisticated algorithms out there that can detect outages and sort of action them as well, really. So that's kind of where we're kind of at now, I think. I've witnessed the evolution of the conversation agents as well with the banks that we were working with. So one of the first ones was that I'm aware of was RBS in Scotland, which is now NatWest Bank, but the Cora conversation agent there, they were one of the first people to do that. That was only about 4 years ago, but you look at that now, it's just like a tidal wave of like conversation agents. It's really good sort of application of that sort of technology. It's really, really effective. So if you take that sort of, where we are now, I think that, some of the things that really caught my attention, my old company, IBM, what they're doing around power systems and the Z platform. So what they're starting to build on-chip AI acceleration. So, that gets really exciting, right? Because you think about fraud detection and how we've all been victims of fraud and things like that. It's usually retroactive, that we sort of start to fix it after the event has happened. But if you're building AI accelerators on chips that are actually processing most of the world's banking transaction data, then that means that you can start to deploy fraud detection models that will detect fraud in real time, and the money savings associated with that are going to be like massive, right? So that could be very cool. I think that moving on, you look at NVIDIA as a company, their strategy and what they're doing. I've worked with them historically in the past. I can see that they've acquired ARM technologies, for building CPUs. They've acquired Mellanox. They build high-speed switches. And they are the undisputed king when it comes to GPU cards, right? They've just released the Hopper, the H100, latest generation there. So what they're doing is they're building incredible sort of capability of supercompute, high-performance computing and AI that's going to power exactly what you're doing, right? So I bet you're rubbing your hands there. But,
I am.
Yeah. So that's really exciting. And what they're doing then is they're tackling industry verticals again, like autonomous vehicles. They'll build toolkits and things like that using that whole ecosystem to be able to do that. Robotics as well, Industry 4.0. The digital twins, sort of side of things, and again into your metaverse world. So that's really cool and really exciting. But I think that we have to sort of be circumspect here. We're moving from narrow AI to broad AI, and then broad AI is going to move to general AI. That comes at a price, and the energy and compute that's required to do all this stuff. I think we really have to seriously think about how we're going to tackle that, because with climate change and climate crisis that we're heading towards, these are really, really resource-intensive applications, and if we're going to improve that, we have to find a new way of doing things. So my final thought on this is really around a new kind of technology that's being worked on by IBM Research at the moment, and that's called analog AI, and I think that's on memory processing. So that means that you're not having to move data around onto accelerators that use lots of energy. That's going to be really transformative, I think, and you can get involved in that right now. They're kind of looking to crowdsource testing that, but that will provide, if that technology works, that will provide massive acceleration towards that sort of utopia of general AI if we ever get there. And also, yeah, the fact that it's such a more sustainable way of doing things. So I think that would be my final thought on that. Sorry about the pause earlier.
Thanks, Mark. So I'd like to kind of just finish with yourself, Kevin. In terms of like your background, you know, you've worked with a lot of amazing people like movie stars and musicians, etc. Like, what are you most excited about as we move into the next wave of technology? And maybe even, are you any fearful in terms of maybe any of the technologies being used for bad?
Yeah, so, you know, I mentioned, of course, Netflix earlier and Facebook earlier. And a lot of people, this is what's great about this particular forum, is that it demystifies how AI is being used, and transparency. And that's what I'm hearing over and over again. The transparency that comes along with it and the governance that comes along with it. A lot of people don't really understand how much AI is being employed across different industries. And so once you have that transparency, it's really going to open up the ability to utilize a lot of this technology. And that's what makes it exciting. You know, we talk about quantum, we talk about different ways for that computing ability then to allow for these technologies to really move. What we're doing right now is, you know, with our Metaverse, we're looking at Unreal Engine, which is Unreal Engine 5. They're moving more to the cloud, which will give us an opportunity to spread across different platforms and have more users. And so once you're able to do that, and platforms that perhaps if you have a supercomputer, well, you know, it's going to be easy for you to be able to utilize these things. But if you don't have a supercomputer, we want as many people as possible to be able to participate in what we're doing. And so this whole immersive, you know, engaging movement towards, it's not just the film and entertainment industry. You know, you talk about other industries that then are going to be able to intersect. So I give this story, you know, my wife and I, we went to Paris before the shutdown. And we went to the Louvre. We only had 4 hours. You know, you need like 3 days or 4 days at the Louvre. And so, you know, we tried to find as much as we can. And then by the time we were on the last hour, we were running all over the place trying to find the things that we wanted to see. But just imagine being able to go to the Louvre virtually first and map out exactly where you're going to go. And not just the Louvre, anywhere in the world, and be able to map that out before you go to that place. Or not everyone's going to have the opportunity to go to the Louvre, but you can have that opportunity both virtually in an augmented way. So that hands down is exciting. But I'll give you another example. We've been in talks with Warner since December. So now we're going into our third meeting, and you know, we really want to do something that's going to wow, and we're going to meet with the big wigs, you know. Looks like something's going to happen. So we made the decision. We have a space station where we have a show that we do. So we decided to bring them into our space station. So we're going to have the meeting in our space station. I mean, like, how cool is that, you know? You'll be able to look around, you know, you see things going on. We'll be able to control it. It'll be like our home, you know? So different things like this, you know, a lot of people are afraid of this brave new world. They're like, oh, I just want connectivity. I want to be connected to people in the real world, you know, and no one is cutting that out, you know? When I say we're not just talking about Metaverse, and I say Xavatar, yeah, it's experiential. So we're talking about different types of experiences, real world experiences, I said augmented reality experiences, connected experiences. But I would say that the bottom line is you will be able to have a different point of connection. You know, and this is really exciting, you know, we incorporated in Ireland. My other partner is in Switzerland. You know, I live here, obviously. And then our other partner lives in Ireland. We incorporated there for a reason, because it's like, you know, this space that they give you a hug, you know, and they bring you in, and you're able to develop, you're able to incubate in the womb before you are birthed out into the world. And that's been exciting, but we've been able to connect, both myself, my Irish partner, my Switzerland partner, because of the technology today. I mean, that was really exciting hearing, you know, within the past 5 years, the acceleration of technology. And so when you talk about NVIDIA and the things that they're doing and all the acquisitions, when you talk about Unreal, when you talk about Unity, for me, it's more democratizing that ability to push this connectivity then that we can have. And so, yes, it's the, you know, the film, media, and entertainment industry, but can you imagine being able to watch a documentary, but not really be a part of the documentary. I mean, we have this project in Haiti, and that's Josh Brolin and Diane Lane and Paul Haggis in the middle of Cirque du Soleil. Can you imagine just like being there and being able to see all of that happening, you know? I mean, this is the magic. And this is what's happening now over the next year, 2 years, 3 years. So
I think that's a lovely philosophical point to end on. So, Lo, we want to see if there's any questions.
First dibs on the space station. I want to check that out.
everyone can come to the space station. They want to
All
see you in
right,
the meeting.
we've got about 5 minutes for questions. Sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. Who wants to go first? I've got questions for these guys. Yes, Gabe.
I asked that question.
Mike?
So it's very. First of all, thank you so much. This is terrific. I love startups, and hear founders talk about their experiences. Very reinvigorating. What's interesting is that we left before lunch with a panel of regulators, and then we started after lunch with a panel of innovators, right? And so on one end, we're saying we need to regulate, etiquette, AI. On one end, we're saying we gotta push the technology as far as the technology wants to go. And I truly believe technology will do what technology is going to do. We can't stop it. So, Hakim, you're developing an AI that can measure and quantify AI in a real world. Kevin, you're developing a startup that has little Xavatar running around mimicking what you do and doing whatever they're gonna do. How do you guys feel about AI and developing technology and AI that will self-regulate or regulate other AIs, taking the human out of the loop, humans who are biased, who are not binaries, who always go back on their decisions, and letting the technology do what the technology is going to do?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. So it's funny because I really wanted to ask a question during the ethics panel, but I didn't get to, and it was a burning. So, of course, we have a technologist point of view to this, right? And I understand the need for people to want to take a non-technologist point of view and bring in the ethics and maybe more regulation, and I really understand it. But the issue that the question I wanted to ask is in the panel, we were really talking about bias and fairness and how AI will work with those issues. But I didn't hear one person ask, okay, what is the inherent bias of the system that the AI is replacing? For instance, I think it was Ryan, I hope I got that correctly, said something about, what if the AI, for white men, it approves loans 90% of the time, and for black women, only 45% of the time? Yeah, and what if the human loan approver before that was doing 90% for white men and 20% for black women? And the issue is that I do find that the whole ethics perspective is relative. And in a lot of cases, AI is coming and replacing human systems that are much more biased. And that people never asked, how do we make them less biased or more fair? I mean, we've tried, like there's a big movement and we're trying, but it's not necessarily measured. And in my technologist point of view is the second the AI is better than the human, replace the human. And of course you have to define what better is, and that's not hard. Sorry, that's very hard. It's very hard to define what better is, though. It's very hard. So I find it interesting, and I think that technologists have to lead on this. As a technologist, surprise, surprise, mainly because it's very complicated from a technological perspective. And for instance, we heard talk about the EU regulation for AI. And we were talking about the different risk classifications of, for the most high risk use cases, AI will just be banned. Well, if that's such a high risk use case for AI, probably it's extremely high risk for humans too. And humans shouldn't be taking those decisions either. Because AI is just acting and learning on the data that humans have labeled. And that data should be a representative of the real world. And the real world has its issues, right? And so what if we classify something as high risk and we can't ever deploy an AI for that use case, and then a week later an algorithm comes out that makes that use case fairer and better than any human system that ever existed? then okay, great. 3 more years for the EU to change the regulation. Or 10, or never. And so the issue with regulating too early is that there is still a lot of things evolving. There's still a lot of things that we don't understand. And I honestly think that the technologists have to lead here because, like I said, the human world is biased, the human world is unfair, and most of the time, any biases and issues that the AI picks up, they're obviously from the data that was labeled by humans. And I'm not saying we shouldn't think about it. We have to think about it extremely carefully. But we always have to compare to the real world. And is it better than the systems we already have in place? And from my experience, most of the time it is. But yeah, that's a hard conversation, and that's like, there's the people side of it as well, and getting people who are not technologists to understand that is quite difficult, and I think it's the work of technologists to try and kind of do that. But as you know, we're not always the best at communicating, so it will definitely be a challenge. I'm curious to.
Very well, Hakim. So yeah.
Great answer.
Yeah. So I'll be as quick as possible, and that's a great question. I mean, look. The human element. When you talk about generational wealth in America, a lot of it is centered on home ownership. And for so long, African Americans, black people have been redlined. And guess what? A study came out last year that the redlining is still as pervasive as it ever was. And a lot of it still, that's with humans, making those decisions. I feel, and it's a check and balance. I talked about transparency. So there definitely needs to be, this kind of transparency about AI and what it does and what ML does. And I think it is happening, like I said, I'm really blown away by this particular summit, and I'm blown away by being connected and involved with Altada, because that's kind of front and center. It's demystifying all of this. And we know, and I agree with Hakim, unbiased decisions, or at least as much as possible, can happen when you utilize a lot of these models, because the data is the data at the end of the day. And so I think that there is a way, like you said, to have this system where you have these models that are looking at the other models and kind of check and balance. But I do think that you also need this check and balance with the human element, because it's a give and take. And so you always have to go into the system and make sure that, or try as best as possible to make sure that this model is not skewing one way or this model is not skewing the other way. You can't just let the system run and not go back in there. And I mean, he mentioned Zillow. I mean, wow, when everybody heard about Zillow, it was like, they can't even believe it. Because when Zillow came, it's like, wow, this is like the next best thing to slice bread. Well, they weren't watching the data. And now look at what happened. What was the number? 300
million.
300 million.
Overpricing, and then 32 billion in market cap when shareholders found out.
Yeah, so you imagine that. So it's the check and balance at the end of the day. Transparency. Having the systems then have, as least amount of bias as possible, but also having the human element, you mentioned that, the human element, be able to, connect on that data on a consistent basis. So.
Can I add one more thing on top of that, actually? I find it very interesting because in a lot of cases, the AI, so that's something interesting that we talk about in NannyML, is that, so the most important thing when using AI for us, when it's in the real world, is knowing how it's performing. But it's interesting because you can actually, I think that in a lot of cases, using AI has actually helped us understand which decision-making processes are biased better than any time before. So basically, because in human decision-making systems, we don't know anything, essentially. Okay, in highly regulated use cases, of course, we know, like in the financial service sectors, we know why decisions happen. But in most use cases, for instance, in customer churn prediction in a media company or something like that's not regulated, we don't know why, how, who is taking decisions or how it's coming out. But now in this like data-driven world and with machine learning models and AI taking decisions, we actually know why the decisions are being taken, how they're being taken, and how it's changing over time. So actually, I think we're also unlocking kind of the inherent bias of the world, or the ability to detect and to see biases that we've never been able before. Because at the end of the day, a decision-making system is a decision-making system. If it's an AI or a human, I mean, we always joke at NannyML that one day we're going to also monitor human decision-making systems, because the system that's taking a decision in the middle doesn't really matter that much, actually. Whether, I mean, a human is an intelligence sometimes, in the end. But I always say that, like, right now we monitor the performance of AI, basically, when you monitor the performance of AI and you know why it's changing, or the performance of a decision-making system, and you see the performance is changing or why it's changing, actually, it's telling you that something in the real world is changing, if it's for the most part. So, like, if you have a credit scoring model and the performance of that model is changing, then the way people take loans and credit risk is actually changing. And we're hoping that by actually being able to monitor these decision-making systems with something like NannyML, that eventually you'll be able to tell decision makers faster than ever that, hey, the real world is changing, and this is how it's changing, and this is how you can take better decisions. So.
The passion, I love it. Alan, these are your people. Thank you guys so much. If you guys have any other questions, send them in and we'll get them back to you.